Welcome to Morning Joe Apologetics. I'm Joe, and today we are going to be continuing on with the class that is normally taught at the Lake Mary campus of Waterstone Church. But due to the coronavirus, everyone's kind of mandated to stay in their homes. And so while we kind of get through this time, I've put together as good of a presentation as I can without the proper video equipment. We normally do this in class as a Sunday school class, so please forgive me. I don't have professional equipment or professional lighting. This is literally something that I've just learned how to do this week with my phone, so please bear with me, and we'll try to get through this as best we can. We've been working through the book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, and what we have kind of landed on for the past several weeks is chapter 3, and we've taken time to kind of pause there in chapter 3 and go over in greater detail than what the book provides some of the evidence that supports the idea of these historical facts. The first one being the evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. In his much larger book, Mike Licona goes over some of these evidences, and that's where I'll be drawing all of my information from today. Is some of it is from the book that we're going over, but then again a lot of it is from Mike Licona's other books, and I'll reference those specifically later. But yes, all of this information must be credited to Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. None of this is mine. So as we go over this, we've considered a few of the major details that would give us reason to believe that the death of Jesus by Roman crucifixion is as solid of a historical fact as one can have in ancient history. And so today we are going over the Criterion of Embarrassment, and then kind of a cherry on top is some of the peripheral details that are gone over in the Gospels. And what we mean by the Criterion of Embarrassment, now we've talked about this in class before, but what we want to say about the Criterion of Embarrassment is it's kind of a type of content that you wouldn't expect to see in the biblical narrative if the disciples were making things up. In other words, if the accusation is the disciples made up their stories about Jesus after the fact, then we would also expect for them to have purposely excluded a good portion of what we actually find, and those are embarrassing details not only about themselves but about Jesus himself too. So as we go through this, we want to keep in mind that we are trying to show the absurdity of the accusation the disciples made it up as part of some propaganda. So one of the first things that we're going to go over today is Jesus' anguish over his death, and specifically in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42, and again, these are referenced in Matthew 26, 36 through 46. That's also the garden account. And Luke, the 22nd chapter, 39 through 46. All three of the synoptic gospels cover the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is multiply attested. That was one of our other criterion, is being multiply attested. But then they're all three including a relatively embarrassing detail, and that is the fact that Jesus, the Son of God, is actually anguishing over his death. The text says that Jesus was very distressed and troubled, and in some of the accounts, he sweat as drops of blood. He was in such agony over the impending torture and death that he knew that he would have to face, that he actually asked God the Father if he could have this cup passed from him. Now, some people say, some people interpret this cup to mean take away my fear, but the text is pretty clear that this cup actually refers to, if there's any other way, God, that we can make this happen besides me being tortured to death, can we do that, please? But actually, no, that's not what he ends up getting. He says, not my will, but yours be done. And he ends up obviously going through and getting crucified. Now, in addition to the fact that the text shows that Jesus is extremely distressed, and he actually, technically, he asks to not go through with it in the way that he actually did, we also have the criterion of embarrassment, where the disciples, who were his main friends and followers, fell asleep on the job when they should have had his back. Now, if you're writing about this after the fact, and you're including the fact that you fell asleep on the job, so to speak, that's a criterion of embarrassment. They would have probably excluded such information unless it was true. And that's the argument that we're making. You don't include these kind of details in a story that you're making up if you want to propagandize and make someone bigger and better than they actually were. You only include these kind of things if it's true. And then we have another example of the criterion of embarrassment in Matthew 27, verse 46, and again paralleled in Mark chapter 15, verse 34. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, there certainly is a good portion of apologetic reference to this, to Psalm, and where Jesus is praying the Psalm, and we will go into that at a later time. But for now, it's enough to say that everyone who reads this verse agrees that this is a legitimate cry to God, that why have you forsaken me? This is not only a reference back to the Psalm, but it is a legitimate cry of anguish, and my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, we'll see in a moment why this is such a contrast to other Jewish martyrs of this time frame. But suffice it to say that this is not the kind of bring it on attitude that you might expect from the writers if they're trying to convince you that Jesus was bigger and badder than anyone else on the planet. And we also see that at the cross, that most of the disciples were nowhere to be found. We have one report of John being there, but other than that, the 12 who were supposed to have his back, they pretty much abandoned him in fear for their own lives. Now, I understand this is a long text, but this is taken from pages 286 through 289 of Mike Licona's bigger book, The Resurrection of Jesus. This is what we are contrasting the anguish of Jesus and his asking for the cup to be taken away, and my God, why have you forsaken me? We're contrasting those with these other accounts in ancient history of Jewish martyrs. So please bear with me as I read this pretty long text. In 2 Maccabees 7 Jewish brothers are tortured and executed brutally for the defiance of the Seleucid king, who ordered them to break Jewish law and eat pork. All right, so they're basically, if they only eat pork, they can get out of this. In turn, each have the skin on their heads removed, their tongues cut out, their hands and feet severed, and are finally placed in a very large hot pan and fried alive. Each faces the consequences of defying the king with great boldness. The first brother proclaims he is ready to die rather than transgress the law. After being tortured, the second brother uses his last breath to tell the king that God will raise them up in spite of his actions against them. The third defiantly sticks out his tongue and hands and tells the king that he received these things from God, whom he hopes to receive them back. And the fourth has been tortured as the others. He tells the king that he looks forward to the resurrection and adds that there will be no resurrection for the king. After the fifth is tortured the same manner, he tells the king that God will torment the king and his offspring. The sixth tells the king that he will not escape unpunished, since he has contended with God. Finally, the seventh likewise tells the king that he will not escape God's punishment. He's then killed more brutally than all the others. Now, the point is, the courage and resolve of these 7 brothers are remarkable. Even more remarkable is the oversight that the second and fourth brothers utter their words of reproach after their tongues have been removed. So we have an example of these brothers acting in comparison to those passages from Jesus. You would think these brothers acted more bravely by certain standards. And then again, we have another example here. In 4 Maccabees 6:1-30, Eleazar is whipped until his flesh is stripped and his sides are pierced. In 6:15-21, Eleazar communicates that more painful than torture is the thought of his being deceptive, compromising his character, becoming a poor example for the young, and thought a coward and unmanly. He's then burned, and stinking fluids are poured down his nostrils. After he's been burned to the bone and is about to die, having maintained his full reasoning abilities throughout the whole ordeal, he prays, informing God that he has endured to the end, although he could have saved himself by disobeying the law. Another example, Rabbi Akiba lived in the 2nd century and was tortured to death by Rome. During his tortures, the time of death comes, and he begins to recite the Shema. One account reports that Akiba then begins to laugh, for which the Roman rulers mock him. Akiba answers that he has loved God with all his heart and means, but that he's not been tested with his life until that very moment. He realizes that now he has finally experienced even that test of life and laughs, and then he dies. And the final one, in the 2nd century, Polycarp is arrested. Now, Polycarp feeds his Roman captors and is given the opportunity to pray for 2 hours. When he's taken into the stadium to be executed, a voice from heaven, heard only by the Christians present, only by the Christians who were there, says, "Be strong, Polycarp, and act like a man." Polycarp refuses the multiple demands of the proconsul to curse Christ and offer allegiance to Caesar. When threatened to be fed to wild animals, to be burned alive, the translation is rough here, but it's in effect he's saying, "Bring it on." When Polycarp is condemned to be burned, he asks the Romans not to nail him as a restraint, since God will enable him to stay on the pyre without moving. He then offers praise and thanks to God for considering him worthy of martyrdom. Again, only the Christians are then privy to seeing that the flames from the arch around Polycarp, they don't consume him, and they smell the scent of incense. When the Romans realize that his body is not being consumed by the flames, an executioner stabs him and kills him, but at that point, so much blood comes out from Polycarp that it puts out the flames. All right, now moving on. We were just looking at those as a kind of a contrast to the anguish of Jesus and the my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Jesus asking for the cup to be taken from him. Now, we look at the disciples not understanding. Now, this is another one of those criteria where if you are the author and you're writing the story about yourself, you're going to want to, if the story is false, you're going to want to make yourself look as good as possible. But these verses don't do that. In Mark 8:31-33, after stating the matter plainly, now the matter is Jesus' impending death, Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. So Peter thinks, hey, you've come to be an earthly Messiah, you've come to set up an earthly kingdom, and then Jesus rebukes him even stronger, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." And then again in Mark chapter 9, verses 31-32, this time he explains the things that will have to happen. They don't get it, but this time they're even afraid to ask for clarification. In Mark chapter 14, verses 27-31, Peter's bold assertion that he will stick with Jesus no matter what. "God, even if everyone else falls away, I'll stand beside you." And Jesus says, "No, in fact, you won't. You will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." And then even after this warning from Jesus, all right, Peter doubles down. He says, "No, even in the face of death, I will stand beside you. I won't betray you." And all the other disciples join in and say the same thing. And we all know how that turned out. They all fled. And again, on the road to Emmaus, I'm sorry, not the road to Emmaus, but after the resurrection, the women find the tomb empty. That's a criterion of embarrassment, but we'll save that for another topic, another one of the historical facts. But the women, they go and they tell the disciples about the empty tomb, and you would have thought, after Jesus repeatedly told them while he was alive to expect this, they still don't get it. And the Bible says, these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. They wouldn't believe the women. Now we get to the road to Emmaus. In Luke 24, you have two disciples walking along the road, and in verse 16, they don't recognize him. There's strike number one. If you're telling a fairy tale about someone who has come back to bodily resurrection, then what you would want to say is that, oh yeah, everyone knew him, and he was seen and instantly recognized. But you get this, the disciples didn't recognize him. And then, to make matters worse, Cleopas admits his unbelief. In verse 21, he says, yeah, this Jesus, he died, and we were hoping that he would have been the one to redeem Israel. We were hoping that it was him, but he died, and so therefore he couldn't have been the one. So what do all these things tell us? The passages of Jesus' mental anguish over his impending death stand in stark contrast to some of the other accounts of Jewish martyrs in that same time frame, where you see the boldness and the bravery, the bring it on attitude. Now, to be sure, Jesus had some very bold moments that even Pilate and those that were there, they were impressed with his demeanor, with his countenance, with the way he held himself together. But you also have these other embarrassing details that, again, if you're making this up to make it, propaganda, then you wouldn't include any of the embarrassing details. You would just include the good stuff. So the fact that you have both, you have those passages where Jesus is, facing his captors like a man, and he's silent before them. He doesn't try to defend himself. You have those, but then you also have the other. And again, the disciples' failure to understand, even though they were repeatedly told. If you're telling this story about yourself and you're making it up to make yourself look good, you're not going to include that kind of stuff. So what we have here is so many accumulated details like this, that we really ought to come to the conclusion that this is an example of honest, humble, truth reporting in ancient biography. Now, I told you we would go over some of the peripheral details. This is, like I said, kind of a cherry on top, and none of these things are strong proofs in and of themselves, but you'd be surprised at how many of these little details have been denied by people, by critical scholars. And in the past several years, we've got ancient discoveries, both through finding ancient records and excavations that have proved these things to be true, or at least given us really good reason to believe that they're true. For example, in Luke 23:27, it says that Luke describes that a large group of people was following Jesus on his way to be executed. And the ancient writer Lucian actually supports this, but in his writings that are not talking about Jesus at all, he's just talking about crucifixion in general, and he also describes large crowds following these criminals along the road to their crucifixion sites. In John 19:32, that's where the soldiers break the legs of the two prisoners, or the two criminals that were hanging on either side of Jesus. And when they get to him, they don't break his legs because he's already dead. Well, we have reports from Cicero in the Gospel of Peter that talk about breaking the legs in order to hasten death in certain cases. But more important than that, we have the idea of them not breaking the legs in order to prolong the death, and to make the experience even more torturous. So the fact that they mention the breaking of the legs or not breaking the legs, in either way you take that, the evidence is there that, yeah, breaking the legs was a thing. And not only that, but we have the excavation in 1968 in Jerusalem, a crucifixion victim named Yehohanan ben Hagakal. Sorry, I butchered that. His remains were exhumed, and it was shown that his shins had been smashed, or one of his shins had been smashed. So you got both the written record and the physical proof of a body that has broken shins to report on that. And then again, in John 19:34, the soldiers pierced Jesus' side. This is after they find out that he's already dead, so they don't break his legs, and instead they pierce him just to make sure that he's dead. We have a quote from Quintilian that says, "As for those who die on the cross, the executioner does not forbid the burying of those who have been pierced." And in John 19:42, and the parallel verses are Luke 23:56, Mark 15:42, Matthew 27:62. These are all the parallel verses that show that the Jews asked to have Jesus taken down because that was against their custom to have people hanging on the day of Sabbath. They couldn't do anything about it on the Sabbath. So they asked their permission to have the body taken down that day so that they could quickly hurry up and bury him so as not to violate any Sabbath rules. Now, we have evidence that this was actually allowed from Josephus. He reports that prior to AD 68, the Romans permitted the crucified to receive a proper burial on the day of their death. Now, the reason that's important is because when this, at this point, we're pretty deep into the weeds, right? We're talking about details of details of details. And some say, oh no, the Romans wouldn't have been that nice. They would have just made him stay up there to, just embarrass him and show their force and humiliation. But no, we actually have evidence of this, extra biblical evidence in Josephus that this was this practice was allowed by the Romans. So, as we wrap up today, I just want to say thank you for joining me in my living room. I hope that this has been a help to you, and I look forward to going over the next chapter with you guys in the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Thank you.